The morning air bit at Sam Tucker's weathered face as he stepped out onto the porch of his farmhouse. The pre-dawn darkness still cloaked the landscape of his cattle ranch outside Ennis, Montana, but Sam had risen with the rhythm of the land. For nearly 4 decades, ever since he'd taken over the family operation from his father. At 59, his 6-foot frame had begun to stoop slightly, his once jet-black hair now a steel gray that matched the morning light, beginning to break over the Tobacco Root Mountains to the east. He pulled his worn leather gloves from the pocket of his Carhartt jacket and whistled softly. Within seconds, Maggie, his 5-year-old border collie, bounded around the corner of the house, her black and white coat barely visible in the dim light. "Morning." "Girl?" Sam said, his breath creating small clouds in the chilly September air. Maggie wagged her tail, eyes bright and alert despite the early hour. Sam reached down to scratch behind her ears, a ritual that started each day on the Tucker Ranch. "Let's go check on those heifers in the north pasture." Sam had moved his small herd of pregnant heifers to the north pasture 3 days earlier. The young cattle were due to calve in the next month, and he wanted them in the more sheltered area before Montana's unpredictable fall weather turned. His ranch wasn't large by Montana standards, just under 400 acres with about 70 head of cattle, but it was enough to keep Sam busy and solvent, especially since his wife, Ellen, had passed from cancer 5 years earlier. He climbed into his aging Ford F-250, the truck groaning to life when he turned the key. Maggie jumped into the passenger seat, her usual perch for their morning rounds. Sam flicked on the headlights, illuminating the dirt road that led from his house toward the northern edge of his property, where tall pines bordered the pasture. And the truck bumped along the uneven road, the familiar motion as much a part of Sam's life as breathing. "Should be a nice day," he said to Maggie, glancing at the gradually lightening sky. The forecast had promised clear skies and temperatures in the high 60s, perfect weather for the fencing repairs he planned to tackle after checking on the cattle. Maggie cocked her head at his voice, her attention divided between Sam and the passing landscape outside the window. As they approached the north pasture, Sam slowed the truck. This section of his land pushed up against the foothills, with Madison River a 1/4 mile beyond his property line. It was beautiful country, but it also meant regular encounters with wildlife. In recent years, grizzly bears had been expanding their territory, moving beyond the confines of Yellowstone National Park about 60 miles to the south. Sam had spotted bear scat on his property several times over the past month, and Fish and Wildlife had issued warnings about increased bear activity in the area. Sam parked near the gate to the north pasture and cut the engine. The silence of the morning enveloped him, broken only by the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance and the first tentative songs of birds greeting the dawn. He grabbed his binoculars from the glove compartment and stepped out of the truck, Maggie jumping down after him. The eastern sky had brightened to a pale gray blue, providing just enough light to make out the dark shapes of his cattle scattered across the pasture. "Come on, girl," he said, opening the gate and stepping through. Maggie trotted ahead, her key, border collie instincts already assessing the herd in the distance. Sam followed more slowly, his knees protesting the uneven ground and the morning chill. He'd been meaning to see Doc Matthews about the increasing stiffness in his joints, but there never seemed to be enough time between the daily demands of the ranch and his monthly trips into Bozeman for supplies. Sam paused about 50 yards into the pasture, lifting his binoculars to scan the herd. He counted 32 heifers, all appearing calm in the early morning light. But as he lowered the binoculars, he noticed Maggie had stopped about 20 yards ahead, her body suddenly rigid, tail straight out behind her. The hair along her spine stood on end, and a low growl emanated from her throat. "Maggie!" Sam called softly, instantly alert. The dog didn't respond, her attention fixed on something near the tree line to their right, where the pasture met the pine forest. Sam slowly turned his head, squinting to see what had caught Maggie's attention. The dim light made it difficult to discern details, but there was definitely something moving at the edge of the trees, something large. Years of living in bear country had taught Sam to be cautious. He began to back up slowly, keeping his eyes on the tree line while reaching for the bear spray he always carried in his jacket pocket. "Maggie, come," he called in a low, firm voice, hoping the dog would retreat with him. But Maggie remained frozen, her growl deepening. The shape at the edge of the trees moved again, and Sam's breath caught in his throat as it emerged into the pasture. Even in the half-light, There was no mistaking the massive form of a grizzly bear. It moved with the distinctive shoulder-rolling gait of its species, head swinging from side to side as it sniffed the air. Sam estimated it stood about 7 feet tall on its hind legs, its weight somewhere north of 600 pounds, a mature male grizzly in his prime. Sam's hand closed around the canister of bear spray in his pocket. His truck was 200 yards behind him, the nearest tree he could climb at least 50 yards away. All his years in Montana had prepared him for this possibility, but now that it was happening, time seemed to slow to a crawl. He knew the rules. Don't run, make yourself look big. Speak in a calm, firm voice and back away slowly if the bear hadn't seen you yet, but the grizzly had already detected their presence. Its head swung toward them, small eyes focusing with terrible intelligence. It dropped to all fours, nose working the air, trying to determine what threat these intruders might pose. Sam could see the massive hump of muscle between its shoulders, the dish-shaped face and the long claws that could disembowel a man with a single swipe. "Hey, bear," Sam called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just passing through. No trouble here." He slowly raised his arms to make himself appear larger, continuing to back away one careful step at a time. Maggie finally responded to the tension in his voice, backing up to position herself between Sam and the bear, her growling continuous now. The grizzly, however, seemed more curious than threatened. It took a step toward them, then another, closing the distance with alarming speed despite its lumbering appearance. Sam's heart hammered in his chest. He had never been this close to a grizzly outside of a vehicle, and the bear's sheer mass was terrifying. Each paw was wider than Sam's face, the head nearly as broad as his chest. "Back away, bear," Sam said more loudly, still trying to sound authoritative rather than afraid. He pulled the bear spray from his pocket, removing the safety clip with his thumb. The red canister seemed painfully inadequate against the approaching predator, but it was his best defense. The grizzly stopped about 30 yards away, rising onto its hind legs to get a better look at them. In the growing light, Sam could see its fur was a dark brown, grizzled with silver-tipped hairs that gave the species its name. A scar ran across its muzzle, evidence of past conflicts. The bear let out a chuffing sound, dropping back to all fours and pawing at the ground. Sam continued his slow retreat, keeping his eyes on the bear, but not making direct eye contact, which might be perceived as a challenge. Maggie stayed with him, her body tense and ready. The grizzly watched them for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, then began to advance again, this time with more purpose. "Maggie, stay close," Sam murmured, his finger poised over the trigger of the bear spray. The dog ignored him, her protective instincts overriding her training. As the bear closed to within 20 yards, moving with increasing speed, Maggie suddenly launched forward, barking fiercely, attempting to drive the much larger animal away from her master. "Maggie, no!" Sam shouted, but it was too late. The little border collie charged the grizzly, darting in to nip at its heels before dancing away from the bear's massive paws. The grizzly roared in surprise and anger, twisting to swipe at the dog. Maggie was quick, barely avoiding the deadly claws, but her attack had turned the bear's full attention toward her, and by extension, toward Sam. With a speed that belied its size, the grizzly charged. Sam had just enough time to raise the bear, spray and depress the trigger, creating a cloud of caustic capsaicin that expanded between him and the charging bear. For a moment, he thought it would work. The bear flinched as the spray hit its face, shaking its massive head and pawing at its eyes. But whether driven by hunger, territorial instinct, or simple aggression, the grizzly pushed through the burning cloud. Sam turned to run, knowing it was futile but unable to override the primal instinct to flee. He had taken only 3 steps when he felt, rather than heard, the bear behind him. A massive weight slammed into his back, driving him face first into the dirt with bone-crushing force. The impact knocked the air from his lungs and sent the bear's spray flying from his hand. Sam tried to curl into a ball to protect his vital organs as he'd been taught, but the grizzly's weight pinned him to the ground. Pain exploded across his left shoulder as the bear's teeth sank through his jacket and into flesh. Sam cried out, the sound seeming distant to his own ears. The grizzly shook him like a rag doll, its teeth grinding against his shoulder blade. Through the haze of pain and terror, Sam could hear Maggie barking frantically, still trying to drive the bear away. The grizzly released his shoulder, and Sam felt its hot breath on the back of his neck. "This is it," he thought with sudden clarity. "This is how I die." But before the bear could deliver a killing bite, Maggie darted in again, this time managing to sink her teeth into the grizzly's hind leg. The bear roared and spun with surprising agility, momentarily releasing Sam to deal with the dog. Seizing his chance, Sam rolled away and staggered to his feet, his left arm hanging useless at his side. Blood soaked his jacket, warm against his chilled skin. The world tilted dangerously, black spots dancing at the edges of his vision. Through the fog of shock and blood loss, he saw the grizzly swipe at Maggie, who barely evaded the blow. "Maggie!" Sam croaked, trying to call the dog to him. To his amazement, she responded, darting back toward him while keeping her eyes on the bear. The grizzly, momentarily confused by the dog's retreat, hesitated. Sam began backing away again, clutching his mangled shoulder with his right hand. Each step sent waves of agony through his body, but survival instinct drove him onward. The bear dropped to all fours, shaking its head one last time to clear the lingering effects of the spray. Then it charged again. Sam braced himself for the impact, knowing he couldn't outrun the bear in his injured state. But Maggie, courageous beyond her size, intercepted the charge, shooting between Sam and the bear and nipping at the grizzly's sensitive nose. The bear reared back, more surprised than hurt, and Maggie used the moment to dash away, leading the bear a few yards to the left before racing back toward Sam. It was a classic border collie herding maneuver, and it bought Sam precious seconds. He stumbled backward, his boots catching on the uneven ground, sending him sprawling onto his injured shoulder. Fresh agony tore a scream from his throat. The sound seemed to refocus the bear's attention. It turned from Maggie and lumbered toward Sam with deadly purpose. Sam tried to rise but couldn't find the strength. Through a red haze of pain, he watched the grizzly approach, its massive paws leaving deep impressions in the earth. Maggie, however, was not done fighting. With a courage that seemed impossible for her 40-pound frame, she launched herself at the bear, this time aiming higher. Her teeth closed on the bear's ear, and she hung on, snarling and twisting. The grizzly roared in pain and rage, rising onto its hind legs and shaking its head violently. Maggie held on for several seconds before being thrown clear, landing hard a dozen yards away. The diversion had given Sam enough time to drag himself another few yards toward the fence line. His vision was tunneling now, consciousness slipping away despite his desperate fight to stay awake. He could hear the bear's heavy breathing, smell its wild, musky odor as it approached him again. Sam rolled onto his back, some primal part of him wanting to face death rather than have it take him from behind. The grizzly loomed over him, its massive head blocking out the brightening sky. Saliva dripped from its open mouth, mixing with the blood, Sam's blood that already stained its muzzle. Sam stared into the bear's small, dark eyes and saw no malice there, only the cold calculation of a predator. This wasn't personal. It was nature in its most elemental form. As the bear lowered its head toward him, Maggie appeared again, seemingly from nowhere. This time she didn't attack, but placed herself directly between Sam and the grizzly, her small body trembling but resolute. She barked with a ferocity Sam had never heard from her before, the sound echoing across the pasture. The cattle in the distance began to move, disturbed by the commotion, their hooves creating a rumble that grew louder by the second. Grizzly hesitated, lifting its head to assess this new development. The herd of pregnant heifers, driven by their own fear, had begun to move toward the disturbance, their natural curiosity overriding their caution. 32 1,100-pound animals in motion created a sound and presence that gave even a grizzly bear pause. The bear looked from Sam and Maggie to the approaching cattle, then back again. Something shifted in its posture, a calculation of risk versus reward. With a final huff that sprayed Sam with warm, fetid breath, the grizzly dropped to all fours and backed away. It cast one more look at the approaching herd, then turned and lumbered toward the tree line with surprising speed, its dark form soon swallowed by the shadows of the pines. Sam lay on his back, the sky spinning above him. Maggie was suddenly at his face, whining anxiously, licking his cheek. He tried to raise his right hand to pet her, but found he didn't have the strength. The pain in his shoulder had transformed into a strange detachment, as though the injured limb belonged to someone else. He knew this was shock setting in, and that he needed help quickly. "Good girl," he whispered to Maggie, whose worried eyes stayed fixed on his face. "Good, brave girl." The herd of heifers had stopped about 50 yards away, their curiosity satisfied now that the bear was gone. Sam needed to get back to his truck to find his phone and call for help. With a Herculean effort, he rolled onto his right side and pushed himself to his knees. The world tilted alarmingly and he retched, bringing up nothing but bile that burned his throat. "Got to move, Maggie," he told the dog, who circled him anxiously. "Got to get help." Each movement was an exercise in agony, but Sam forced himself to his feet, swaying dangerously before finding his balance. His left arm hung limp and useless, the sleeve of his jacket saturated with blood. He began the long walk back toward the gate, each step a victory against the pain and weakness that threatened to pull him back to the ground. Maggie stayed at his heel, occasionally looking up at him with concerned eyes. Once, when he stumbled, she pressed against his leg, somehow understanding that he needed the support. The 200 yards to the gate seemed to stretch into miles, the morning light now fully illuminating the landscape that had been in shadow when they arrived. By the time Sam reached the gate, his pants and boots were soaked with blood that had run down his arm and dripped from his fingertips. He fumbled with the latch using his right hand, his fingers clumsy with cold and shock. Finally, the gate swung open, and he staggered through, making for his truck. The effort of climbing into the cab nearly undid him. Black spots danced before his eyes, and a roaring filled his ears. He slumped behind the wheel, fumbling in his eager pocket for the keys with fingers that felt thick and unresponsive. Maggie jumped in beside him, pressing against his right side as though trying to lend him her warmth and strength. Sam's first attempt to insert the key into the ignition failed, the key slipping from his bloodied fingers to the floor. He bent to retrieve it, a wave of dizziness washing over him so strongly that he had to grip the steering wheel to keep from falling sideways. After what seemed like an eternity, he managed to start the truck, the familiar rumble of the engine offering a small comfort. Driving one-handed, fighting against shock and blood loss, Sam navigated the rutted road back toward his house. Each bump sent fresh agony through his shoulder, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. He needed to reach his phone, which he'd left on the kitchen counter. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and at this hour, they might not be awake. The 5-minute drive back to the house seemed to take hours. By the time Sam pulled up to his front porch, the edges of his vision had grown dim, and he was shivering violently despite the truck's heater blasting warm air. He cut the engine and nearly fell out of the driver's side door, catching himself against the frame at the last moment. Maggie jumped out after him, staying close as he staggered up the 3 steps to his front door. The screen door protested with a creak as he pushed it open, leaving a bloody handprint on the faded wood. Inside, the house was quiet and dim, the morning light filtering through the curtains Ellen had hung years ago. Sam made his way to the kitchen, his boots leaving red marks on the linoleum floor. His cell phone lay where he'd left it, next to the coffee maker that he'd prepared the night before, but hadn't had time to start before heading out to check the cattle. Sam picked up the phone with a hand that seemed to belong to someone else, his fingers slick with blood, as he dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice seemed to come from very far away. 911, what's your emergency? Bear attack, Sam managed to say, his voice a rasp. North pasture, I'm at the house now, need help. He gave his address, a process that took far more concentration than it should have. Sir, are you injured? The dispatcher's voice sharpened with concern. Yes. Shoulder, torn up pretty bad. Losing blood. I'm dispatching emergency services. Now, can you tell me your name? Sam Tucker. Speaking was becoming more difficult, his tongue feeling thick in his mouth. Please hurry. Mr. Tucker, I need you to sit down if you can. Apply pressure to the wound. Can you do that? Sam looked down at his shoulder, really seeing the extent of the damage for the first time. The grizzly's teeth had torn through his jacket and shirt, leaving a gaping wound that exposed muscle and bone. Blood continued to seep from the injury, though not with the pulsing force that would indicate a severed artery. Small mercies, he thought distantly. Mr. Tucker, are you still there? Yeah, Sam mumbled. Sitting down now. He lowered himself to one of the kitchen chairs, the effort nearly causing him to black out. Maggie whined and placed her head on his knee, her eyes never leaving his face. Is there someone with you? The dispatcher asked. Just my dog, Maggie. She saved my life. Saying the words, aloud made them real, and a wave of gratitude washed over Sam. He reached out with his good hand to stroke Maggie's head. Good girl. Such a good, brave girl. Mr. Tucker, Emergency services are on their way. They should be there in about 15 minutes. I need you to stay on the line with me until they arrive." Sam tried to respond, but the words wouldn't form. The kitchen seemed to be growing darker, the dispatcher's voice more distant. He felt Maggie's wet nose against his hand, heard her anxious whine as his phone slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. The last thing Sam was aware of before consciousness left him completely was Maggie's barking, urgent and insistent, calling for help in the only way she knew how. The sound of sirens penetrated the darkness first, followed by voices, unfamiliar, professional, concerned. Sam drifted in and out of awareness as paramedics secured him to a backboard, established IV lines and loaded him into an ambulance. Through it all, he was vaguely aware of Maggie's presence, her refusal to leave his side until someone, he couldn't see who, finally picked her up and carried her away. The ambulance ride was a blur of movement, voices, and the sharp sting of needles. Sam caught fragments of conversation, significant blood loss, multiple lacerations, possible fractures, medevac standing by. He tried to ask about Maggie, but couldn't form the words. The pain in his shoulder had returned with a vengeance, burning through the fog of shock, only to be muted again by something cool that flowed into his veins. At some point, the ambulance stopped, and he was transferred to a helicopter. The noise was deafening, the vibration a continuous tremor that seemed to reach into his bones. A face appeared above him, young, female, intent. A flight nurse, he realized dimly. Her lips moved, but he couldn't hear her words over the rotor noise. She adjusted something on his IV, and the world faded to gray, then black. When Sam next opened his eyes, the world had changed entirely. He lay in a hospital bed, the stark white of the room almost painful after the darkness. A steady beeping sound marked the rhythm of his heart, and the antiseptic smell of the hospital filled his nostrils. His left shoulder and arm were heavily bandaged and immobilized against his chest. An IV line ran into his right arm, and a pulse oximeter clipped his finger. "Welcome back, Mr. Tucker." A nurse stood beside his bed, adjusting one of the monitors. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "You gave us quite a scare." Sam tried to speak, but his throat felt as though he'd swallowed ground glass. The nurse noticed his discomfort and held a cup of water with a straw to his lips. The cool liquid was the most wonderful thing Sam had ever tasted. "Maggie," he managed after several sips, "my dog. Is she okay?" The nurse smiled. "Your dog is fine. Sheriff Donovan brought her to the animal hospital to be checked out, but they didn't find any serious injuries, just some minor cuts and bruises. She's staying with your neighbor for now, a Mr. Jenkins." Relief flooded through Sam. Bill Jenkins owned the ranch that bordered his to the west, and they'd been friends for nearly 30 years. Maggie would be well cared for until he could get home. "How bad?" Sam asked, looking down at his bandaged shoulder. The nurse's expression grew more serious. "You've got some significant injuries, Mr. Tucker. The bear's teeth caused multiple deep lacerations, and you have fractures to your clavicle and scapula. Dr. Reynolds performed surgery to repair the damage and clean the wounds. You've also received several units of blood. You're on antibiotics to prevent infection. Bear bites are notorious for causing nasty infections." Sam nodded, processing this information. "How long?" "You've been here about 18 hours. It's just after 10 in C. The morning now. You arrived yesterday around 4 in the afternoon." She checked his IV. "The doctor will be in shortly to talk to you. In the meantime, there's a Fish and Wildlife officer and a sheriff's deputy waiting to speak with you when you're up to it. Should I tell them to come back later?" Sam considered this. His mind was foggy from pain medication, but he was clear enough to answer questions. "They can come in." The nurse nodded. "I'll let them know, but I'll tell them to keep it short. You need your rest." She paused at the door. "You're a lucky man, Mr. Tucker. Another few minutes without treatment and we might be having a very different conversation." After she left, Sam lay back against the pillows, trying to gather his thoughts. The attack played in his mind like a movie. The bear emerging from the tree line, Maggie's desperate defense, the bone-crushing power of the grizzly's jaws. He raised his right hand to his face, surprised to find it trembling. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. 2 men entered, one in the tan, uniform of the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department, the other wearing the brown uniform of the Madison County Sheriff's Office. The wildlife officer was younger, perhaps in his early 30s with a trim build and alert eyes. The deputy was older, heavy-set, with the weathered face of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. "Mr. Tucker," the wildlife officer said, stepping forward. "I'm Officer Mike Callahan with Fish and Wildlife. This is Deputy Phil Garrison. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the bear attack, if you feel up to it." Sam nodded, gesturing weakly with his right hand for them to proceed. "Can you tell us exactly what happened?" Callahan asked, pulling a small notebook from his shirt pocket. Sam recounted the events of the previous morning as clearly as he could, describing the bear's appearance, behavior, and the sequence of the attack. Both men listened attentively, occasionally asking for clarification. "And you're certain it was a grizzly?" Officer Callahan asked when Sam had finished. "Not a black bear?" "Definitely a grizzly," Sam confirmed. "Dish-faced profile, hump between. The shoulders silver-tipped fur, about 7 feet tall when it stood up, had a scar across its muzzle." Callahan nodded, making notes. "That description matches reports we've had of a male grizzly that's been expanding his territory outside the normal range. There have been several sightings in the area over the past month." "Any other attacks?" Sam asked. "None on humans," the officer replied. "A couple of livestock predations about 10 miles south of your property last week. A calf and 2 sheep." Deputy Garrison spoke up. "You did everything right, Mr. Tucker. Bear spray, trying to back away slowly. Sometimes, even when you follow all the precautions, these things just happen. If my dog hadn't been there..." Sam let the sentence trail off, the reality of how close he'd come to death settling heavily on him. "Border collies are something else," Garrison said with a nod. "Brave little dogs." "What happens now?" Sam asked. "With the bear, I mean." Officer Callahan tucked his notebook away. "We've got a team out tracking it based on the location of the attack. If we find it, we'll have to make a decision based on its behavior. A bear that's attacked a human is generally considered a danger to public safety. Would you euthanize it?" Sam was surprised to find he felt conflicted about this. The bear had nearly killed him, yet it had only been acting according to its nature. "That's one option," Callahan acknowledged. "Relocation is another, though grizzlies that have attacked humans often repeat the behavior. We'll assess the situation when and if we locate the animal." They asked a few more questions about the exact location of the attack and whether Sam had seen the bear on his property before. After about 15 minutes, the nurse returned, giving the officers a pointed look. "That's all for now, Mr. Tucker," Deputy Garrison said, standing. "We'll check back with you later. Get some rest." After they left, the nurse checked Sam's vitals and adjusted his pain medication. "The doctor will be in to see you soon," she promised. "Is there anyone you'd like us to call for you? Family?" Sam shook his head. His parents had passed years ago, and Ellen had been an only child. Their son, David, lived in Seattle with his wife and 2 children, but Sam was reluctant to worry them. "I'll call my son later," he told the nurse, "when I'm a bit more clear-headed." She nodded understandingly and left him alone with his thoughts. Sam tried to stay awake to wait for the doctor, but the combination of pain medication, physical trauma, and emotional exhaustion soon pulled him back into sleep. When he woke again, the light in the room had changed, shadows lengthening as afternoon gave way to evening. A man in a white coat stood at the foot of his bed reviewing a chart. He looked up when Sam stirred. "Mr. Tucker, good to see you awake. I'm Dr. Reynolds. I performed your surgery yesterday." The doctor was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and glasses that he peered over as he spoke. "How bad is it?" Sam asked, his voice stronger than it had been earlier. Dr. Reynolds moved to the side of the bed. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward Sam's bandaged shoulder. At Sam's nod, he carefully began to remove the outer bandages, revealing layers of gauze beneath. "The bear's teeth caused significant damage to your deltoid and trapezius muscles. You have compound fractures of your clavicle and scapula, the collarbone and shoulder blade," he clarified, seeing Sam's blank look. "We've inserted pins to stabilize the fractures, and I've repaired the muscle damage as best I could." He gently replaced the bandages. "The good news is that no major arteries were severed, though you lost a considerable amount of blood. We've got you on powerful antibiotics to prevent infection, which is the primary concern with animal bites of this nature. Will I regain full use of my arm?" This was the question that had been weighing on Sam's mind. Her cattle rancher with one functioning arm would face significant challenges. Dr. Reynolds' expression grew more serious. "It's too early to say with certainty, The damage was extensive. With proper physical therapy and time to heal, you should regain most of your function. But I want to be honest with you. You may have permanent limitations in terms of strength and range of motion. We're talking about a recovery process of at least 6 months, possibly longer. Sam absorbed this news silently. 6 months. The upcoming calving season, spring planting, fence repairs, all of it would have to be managed one-handed, or with hired help he could ill afford. When can I go home? He asked finally. We'll need to keep you here for at least 3 more days to monitor for infection and manage your pain. After that, assuming there are no complications, you can continue your recovery at home with periodic checkups. Dr. Reynolds made a note on the chart. Do you live alone, Mr. Tucker? Yes. Since Ellen's death, the farmhouse had often seemed too large, too empty, despite Maggie's companionship. The doctor nodded thoughtfully. You'll need some assistance for the first few weeks at least. Basic tasks like dressing, bathing, and cooking will be difficult with your arm immobilized. Is there someone who could stay with you? Family, perhaps. Sam thought of his son in Seattle with his tech job and young family. Asking David to take weeks away from his life to help on the ranch seemed impossible. I'll figure something out, he said, not meeting the doctor's eyes. Dr. Reynolds seemed to understand the situation. We have social services that can help arrange for home health care in cases like yours. I'll have someone from that department come speak with you tomorrow. After the doctor left, Sam reached for the phone beside his bed. It was time to call David. His son answered on the 3rd ring, his voice immediately brightening when he recognized Sam's number. Dad, I was just thinking about you. How are things in Montana? Sam hesitated, unsure how to begin. There's been an accident, son. The conversation that followed was difficult. David's initial shock and concern quickly turned to insistence that he would fly out immediately. Sam tried to dissuade him, arguing that it wasn't necessary, that he would be fine on his own, but David was adamant. I'm booking a flight right now, he said, the sound of computer keys clicking in the background. Katie and the kids will understand. You need help, Dad, whether you want to admit it or not. By the time they hung up, David had confirmed a flight for the following afternoon. He would arrive in Bozeman by evening and drive the 60 miles to Ennis, reaching the hospital by nightfall. Despite his protests, Sam felt a profound relief knowing his son was coming. The prospect of facing his recovery alone had been more daunting than he'd wanted to acknowledge. The next day brought a parade of medical professionals, nurses checking his vitals and changing his bandages, a physical therapist explaining the long road of rehabilitation ahead, a social worker discussing home health care options, and a hospital administrator reviewing insurance coverage and payment plans. Through it all, Sam felt a growing impatience to be home, back on his land, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of the ranch. By late afternoon, exhaustion had claimed him again, and he dozed fitfully, his dreams filled with the image of the grizzly's face looming over him, its hot breath on his skin. He woke with a start to find a figure standing beside his bed. For a disoriented moment, he thought it was another doctor or nurse, but then the figure leaned forward into the light. Dad? David. Relief flooded through Sam at the sight of his son. At 34, David strongly resembled Sam in his younger years, though he was leaner, his hands softer from years behind a desk rather than working the land. You made good time. David set down his carry-on bag and moved to embrace his father, careful to avoid the injured shoulder. Flight got in early, and I broke a few speed limits on the drive from Bozeman. He pulled back, his face tight with concern as he took in the bandages, the IV lines, the monitoring equipment. Jesus, Dad, when you said accident, I was thinking, maybe you fell off a ladder or something. Not a bear attack. I didn't want to worry you unnecessarily, Sam said, feeling suddenly sheepish under his son's scrutiny. Unnecessarily? David's voice rose slightly. Dad, you nearly died. That seems like a pretty necessary thing to worry about. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Sam recognized as one of his own. The nurse I spoke to in the hall said, if you'd been alone, if your dog hadn't been there, but I wasn't alone, and Maggie was there, Sam cut in, not wanting to dwell on how close it had been. How are Katie and the kids? David accepted the change of subject with a small sigh. They're good. Emma started kindergarten last month. She's loving it. And Max is crawling everywhere, getting into everything. He pulled out his phone to show Sam recent photos of his grandchildren. Emma with her front teeth missing, grinning. Widely in her school uniform, Max with food smeared across his face, looking delighted with himself. The sight of his grandchildren brought a smile to Sam's face. He'd last seen them at Christmas 8 months ago. Too long, he thought, with a pang of regret. The distance between Montana and Washington had always seemed insisted on caring for her himself during her final months, refusing offers of help from hospice or friends, determined to be the one by her side day and night. The toll it had taken on him had been visible to everyone but himself. "The farm, ranch," Sam began, but David interrupted. "I've already called Bill Jenkins. He's going to check on the cattle daily and handle the essential chores until you're back on your feet. And he said Maggie is doing fine. She's been helping him with his own herd like she's worked for him all her life." Sam felt a lump form in his throat at the mention of Maggie. "She saved my life." "I know." David's voice was gentle. "Bill told me what the wildlife officer said about the attack. She's quite the hero. Always has been a good dog," Sam said, his voice rough with emotion. "Best I've ever had." They talked for another hour, catching up on news and making plans for Sam's discharge from the hospital. David would stay in the spare bedroom at the ranch, help with Sam's care, and manage the property as best he could with guidance from his father and assistance from Bill Jenkins. It was a temporary solution, but it would give Sam time to heal enough to handle things on his own. When visiting hours ended, David reluctantly left to drive to the ranch and get settled. He promised to return in the morning, bringing clean clothes for Sam to wear home when he was discharged. As his son's footsteps faded down the corridor, Sam felt both gratitude for David's presence and a nagging worry about being a burden. He'd always been the caretaker, the provider. Being on the receiving end of help didn't sit easily with him. The next 2 days passed in a blur of medical evaluations, paperwork, and preparations for discharge. Dr. Reynolds seemed satisfied with Sam's progress. No sign of infection. Pain manageable with oral medication, vital signs stable. By mid-morning on the 3rd day after the attack, Sam was seated in a wheelchair at the hospital entrance, waiting for David to bring the truck around. "Remember what we discussed, Mr. Tucker," the discharge nurse said, handing him a folder of paperwork. "No lifting with that arm, keep the shoulder immobilized, take the antibiotics exactly as prescribed, and follow up with Dr. Matthews in Ennis in 1 week. Physical therapy starts in 2 weeks. Don't skip those appointments." Sam nodded, impatient to be gone. The folder went into a plastic bag along with his prescriptions and the few personal items David had brought from home. His left arm was secured in a complex sling that held it immobile against his chest, and beneath his shirt layers of bandages protected the surgical incisions and healing wounds. David pulled up in Sam's truck, jumping out to help his father, into the passenger seat. The reversal of their usual roles felt strange to Sam. He'd taught David to drive in this very vehicle nearly 20 years ago. Now he was the one being assisted, incapable of even securing his own seatbelt. The drive from Bozeman back to Ennis took just over an hour. The familiar landscape rolling by outside. The window. The Tobacco Root Mountains rose to the east, the Madison Range to the west, the valley between them a patchwork of ranches, small farms, and stretches of public land. September had painted the aspens and cottonwoods along the Madison River in shades of gold and amber, a reminder that winter wasn't far off. As they approached the turnoff to the ranch, Sam felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. The north pasture where the attack had occurred lay just beyond the curve in the road. He could see the fence line, the gate he'd struggled to open with blood-slick fingers, the spot where he'd nearly died. David, sensing his father's tension, slowed the truck. "You okay, Dad?" Sam nodded wordlessly, unable to articulate the mixture of fear, gratitude, and lingering shock that washed over him at the sight of the pasture. The heifers had been moved. Bill Jenkins had likely relocated them to the south pasture after the attack, following the protocols they'd established years ago for predator incidents. They passed the pasture and continued down the gravel road toward the house. The 2-story farmhouse came into view, its white-clapboard siding and green shutters unchanged since Sam's grandfather had built it in the 1930s. Beside it stood the large red barn, various outbuildings, and the equipment shed, where Sam kept his tractor and haying machinery. It was all so familiar, so ordinary, that for a moment Sam could almost believe the attack had been nothing more than a particularly vivid nightmare. But the pain in his shoulder, the weakness in his body, and the prescription bottles rattling in the plastic bag beside him were stark reminders of reality. This was his home, his life's work. But suddenly it all seemed fragile, vulnerable in a way he'd never fully recognized before. David parked in front of the house and came around to help Sam out of the truck. They were halfway to the porch when the screen door burst open and Maggie exploded out barking joyfully. She raced down the steps and circled Sam's legs, her entire body wiggling with excitement, whining and jumping up to lick his hand. "Maggie, easy girl," David cautioned, concerned about his father's balance, but Sam was already crouching awkwardly, his good arm extended to the dog. "Hey girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion as Maggie pressed against him, covering his face with kisses. "I missed you too." Sam examined her carefully, finding only a few small cuts on her muzzle and a patch of fur missing from her right flank. Considering what she'd faced, her injuries were remarkably minor. "You're one tough little dog," he told her, scratching behind her ears with his right hand. Bill Jenkins appeared in the doorway, his lanky frame familiar against the backdrop of the kitchen. "Welcome home, Sam," he called, coming down to meet them. He was Sam's age, with a weathered face and the calloused hands of a lifetime rancher. "Glad to see you, Vertical." Sam straightened with David's help, accepting Bill's careful handshake. "Thanks for looking after things, Bill, and for taking care of Maggie." "Least I could do," Bill replied with a dismissive wave. "That dog of yours is worth her weight in gold. Been helping me move my cattle like she was born to it." He looked down at Maggie, who had returned to Sam's side, pressing against his leg. "Though she's been watching the door like a hawk since I brought her back from the vet, waiting for you." The three men and Maggie made their way into the house. Sam was struck by how clean everything was. The bloody boot prints he'd left on the kitchen floor were gone, the counters wiped down, dishes put away. Even the coffee maker gleamed as though recently scrubbed. "Katie called yesterday," David explained, seeing his father's surprise. "She had me take pictures of every room so she could tell me what needed cleaning and where to find everything. Said you shouldn't come home to a mess." Sam felt a rush of gratitude for his daughter-in-law's thoughtfulness. "Tell her I appreciate it." Bill stayed for a cup of coffee, updating Sam on the condition of the herd. All accounted for and doing fine. The state of the fences. That north section still needs work, but I patched it temporarily. And the current gossip in town. Everyone's talking about your tangle with the grizzly. You're practically a local celebrity. When Bill rose to leave, he paused, his expression growing serious. "That bear's still out there, Sam. Fish and Wildlife tracked it for a while, but they lost the trail up in the high country. They've posted warnings, but you might want to be extra cautious for a while." Sam nodded, feeling a chill at the thought of the grizzly still roaming the area. "I'm not planning any hikes in the near future," he said, attempting humor that fell flat against the reality of his injuries. After Bill left, David helped Sam settle in the living room recliner, positioning pillows to support his injured shoulder and bringing him a glass of water and his pain medication. Maggie curled up at his feet, apparently determined not to let him out of her sight again. The familiar surroundings brought a measure of comfort, but Sam couldn't shake the sense of vulnerability that had started at the hospital. For nearly 4 decades, he'd worked this land with the confidence of a man in control of his domain. Now, sitting in his own living room, dependent on others for the most basic tasks, he felt like a stranger in his own life. "You should rest." "Dad?" David said, noticing his father's drawn expression. "Doctor's orders." Sam didn't argue. The drive from Bozeman had exhausted him more than he wanted to admit. He closed his eyes, letting the pain medication carry him into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of teeth and claws and Maggie's desperate barking. The days fell into a pattern. David helped Sam with the tasks he couldn't manage one-handed: dressing, bathing, preparing meals. Each morning, David would go out with Bill to check the cattle and handle the essential ranch work, returning midday to check on Sam before going out again in the afternoon. Maggie divided her time between accompanying David and staying close to Sam, her protective instincts seemingly heightened since the attack. A week after coming home, Sam had his first follow-up appointment with Dr. Matthews in Ennis. The local doctor, who had known Sam for 20 years, was cautiously optimistic about his recovery. "The surgical team in Bozeman did excellent work," he said, examining the healing wounds. "No sign of infection, and the fractures appear to be stabilizing nicely." He adjusted Sam's sling slightly. "But you've got a long road ahead, Sam. This isn't something you can rush." Later that afternoon, Deputy Garrison stopped by the ranch. He'd brought the official report of the attack for Sam to review and sign, a necessary formality for the Fish and Wildlife investigation. Sam sat at the kitchen table, reading through the clinical description of his ordeal, while David made coffee and Maggie watched from her spot by the door. "Any sign of the bear?" Sam asked as he signed the report. Garrison shook his head. "Nothing. Definitive. We've had a couple of sightings reported north of here, but no clear evidence it's the same animal. Officer Callahan has 2 trail cameras set up on game paths near your property, hoping to get confirmation one way or another." "What happens if you find it?" David asked, setting mugs of coffee on the table. "That's still being decided," Garrison replied. "Fish and Wildlife doesn't like to euthanize grizzlies. They're still a protected species, despite being delisted from the endangered list. But an animal that's attacked a human presents a significant public safety risk." He took a sip of coffee. "For now, we're advising everyone in the area to be extra cautious. No hiking alone, carry bear spray, make noise when you're in the backcountry. The usual precautions, but with added emphasis." After the deputy left, Sam found himself staring out the kitchen window toward the north pasture. Somewhere out there, the grizzly that had nearly killed him was going about its life, hunting, foraging, preparing for winter hibernation. There was no malice in its actions, no vendetta. It had simply been a bear, doing what bears do when they perceive a threat or opportunity. "Everything okay, Dad?" David had noticed his father's distant expression. Sam turned from the window. "Just thinking." "About the bear?" "About all of it." Sam gestured vaguely with his good hand. "The attack, the ranch. What comes next?" He met his son's concerned gaze. "I'm 59, David. This kind of injury at my age, I may not get back to where I was before." David nodded, understanding the unspoken question. "And you're wondering what that means for the ranch?" "It's been in our family for 3 generations, Sam said quietly. "I always assumed I'd work it until I couldn't anymore, then pass it on to you, but I know that's not the life you wanted." David was silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I love this place, Dad. I grew up here, learned to ride, to fish, to work hard, all of it. But you're right, ranching isn't my calling." He looked around the kitchen, with its well-worn counters and the calendar still featuring Ellen's handwriting in the margins. "That doesn't mean I don't care what happens to it. I may have to consider selling," Sam said, the words painful to voice aloud. "If I can't run it properly, if it becomes too much." "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," David replied, placing a hand on his father's good shoulder. "You're still at the beginning of your recovery. Dr. Matthews said you're doing well. Let's see how things progress before making any decisions about the ranch's future." Sam nodded, grateful for his son's measured response. The prospect of selling the ranch felt like a betrayal of his family's legacy, of the work he'd put into the land for decades. But the reality of his situation couldn't be ignored. A cattle operation required physical labor, long hours, and the ability to handle emergencies alone. If his shoulder didn't heal properly, if he was left with significant limitations, the thoughts circled in his mind throughout the evening as they ate dinner and watched a baseball game on the small television in the living room. By the time Sam went to bed, Maggie curled at his feet as had become her habit since the attack. He'd reached no conclusions, only a grim determination to face whatever came with the same resilience he'd applied to every other challenge in his life. 2 weeks after the attack, Sam began physical therapy at the small medical clinic in Ennis. The therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel, put him through a series of gentle exercises designed to maintain mobility in his shoulder without disturbing the healing fractures. "The goal right now is to prevent stiffness and atrophy," she explained as she guided his arm through small, controlled movements. "Once the bones have healed more fully, we'll start working on rebuilding strength and increasing your range of motion." The sessions were painful and left Sam exhausted, but he approached them with the same stubborn determination he applied to ranch work. Rachel seemed to appreciate his attitude, pushing him just enough to make progress without risking further injury. "You ranchers are all the same," she told him with a wry smile after a particularly challenging session. "Too tough for your own." "Good, but in this case that stubbornness might work in your favor." As September gave way to October, the aspens turned fully golden, their leaves rustling in the increasingly cool breezes that swept down from the mountains. David's 2 weeks of family leave stretched to 3, as it became clear that Sam still needed significant help. They established a routine, Mornings spent on ranch work, afternoons on physical therapy and recovery, evenings planning for the following day. Bill Jenkins continued to assist with the more demanding tasks, bringing his teenage son to help with fence repairs and moving cattle from summer pastures to fields closer to the barn in preparation for winter. The community rallied around Sam in the quiet, practical way of rural neighbors. Casseroles appeared on the porch, offers of help came without fanfare, and fellow ranchers stopped by to assist with tasks that required more hands than David could provide alone. Through it all, Maggie remained Sam's constant companion, her attentiveness bordering on vigilance. She slept at the foot of his bed, followed him from room to room, and positioned herself between him and any visitor who came to the door. The border collie, who had always been a good working dog, had transformed into something more, a guardian, whose devotion had been forged in the crucible of shared danger. In the third week of October, with the first light snows dusting the higher elevations, David sat down with Sam after dinner to discuss his eventual return to Seattle. "Katie and the kids need me back," he said, his discomfort evident in the way he couldn't quite meet his father's eyes. "And my leave is running out. I've already extended it longer than I should have." Sam nodded, having anticipated this conversation. "You've done more than enough, son. I'm managing better now." It was true. He could dress himself with minimal assistance, prepare simple meals, and handle many of the daily tasks of living. His therapy was progressing well, though Rachel insisted he was still months away from attempting any serious ranch work. "I don't like leaving you alone," David admitted. "Not yet." "I won't be alone," Sam replied, glancing down at Maggie, who lay at his feet as usual. "And Bill checks in every day. The home health nurse comes twice a week. I'll be fine." David didn't look convinced, but he recognized the stubborn set of his father's jaw. "What about the long term? Winter's coming. Even with two good arms, the work only gets harder when the snow flies." Sam had been considering this problem for weeks. "I've been talking to Bill about hiring his son part-time. Jake's a good kid, knows cattle, and could use the extra money for college. Between him and the other neighbors, we can keep things going until I'm back to full strength." "And if you don't get back to full strength?" David asked gently. "Dad, I know you don't want to hear this, but you need to consider the possibility that this injury might prevent you from running the ranch the way you always have." Sam was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. "I know," he finally said. "I'm not blind to the realities, David. But this land, this life, it's who I am. I'm not ready to give it up without a fight." David recognized the futility of pushing further. His father had always been stubborn, a trait that had served him well through decades of ranching in Montana's unforgiving climate. "Just promise me you'll be honest with yourself about what you can and can't do. Don't take risks that might undo all the healing you've done." Sam nodded, though both men knew the promise would be tested in the months to come. They spent the rest of the evening discussing practical matters, finances, who would check in on Sam and when, emergency contacts, and a schedule for David's return visits. By the time they turned in for the night, a plan had been established that, while not ideal, would allow David to return to his family while ensuring Sam had the support he needed. 3 days later, Sam stood on the porch with Maggie at his side, watching as David loaded his suitcase into the truck for the drive to Bozeman and his flight back to Seattle. The morning was cold, their breath visible in the crisp air, the surrounding mountains outlined sharply against a cloudless blue sky. "You've got the numbers for Bill, Dr. Matthews, Rachel, and the Home Health Service," David said, running through the checklist they'd created. "And you'll call if anything changes, if you need help or if you just want to talk." Sam smiled at his son's concern. "I've got all the numbers, all the instructions, and all the dire warnings about what will happen if I don't follow doctor's orders." "I'll be fine, David. Go home to your family." David stepped forward and carefully embraced his father, mindful of the still healing shoulder. "I'll be back at Thanksgiving," he promised. "Sooner if you need me. Give my love to Katie and the kids," Sam replied, returning the hug with his good arm. "And thank her again for all the organizing she did from afar. This place hasn't been this clean since your mother was alive." They shared a smile at that, the mention of Ellen no longer carrying the sharp edge of grief it once had. David knelt to ruffle Maggie's ears. "Take care of him, girl," he told the dog, who wagged her tail in what seemed like a solemn promise. After David's truck disappeared down the driveway, Sam and Maggie remained on the porch, the silence of the ranch settling around them like a familiar blanket. It was the first time Sam had been truly alone since the attack. The thought brought a momentary flash of unease, quickly followed by a determination to reclaim his independence. "Well, Maggie," he said, looking down at the dog, "looks like it's just you and me again." Maggie pressed against his leg in response, her warm presence a reassurance. Sam spent that first day adjusting to David's absence, finding his own rhythm for tasks that had been shared over the past month. It took him twice as long to make breakfast, longer still to feed the chickens, and check the small garden, but he managed. Bill Jenkins stopped by mid-morning as promised, helping Sam move a few hay bales and checking the water tanks before heading back to his own ranch. By evening, Sam was exhausted but satisfied with what he'd accomplished. He sat in the kitchen with a simple dinner of soup and sandwich, Maggie watching hopefully for any dropped morsels. The house felt emptier without David, but not in the hollow way it had after Ellen's death. This was a temporary solitude, a necessary step in reclaiming his life. As October gave way to November, Sam settled into a new routine. 3 days a week, he drove into Ennis for physical therapy with Rachel, who continued to push him toward recovery with a mixture of encouragement and tough love. The home health nurse, a pleasant woman named Karen, visited twice weekly to check his healing wounds and monitor his overall health. Bill or his son Jake came by daily to help with the heavier ranch work, and Sam gradually increased his own activities as his strength returned. The Sheriff's Department and Fish and Wildlife continued their search for the grizzly that had attacked Sam, but as the weeks passed with no confirmed sightings near his property, the urgency of the hunt diminished. Officer Callahan removed the trail cameras, explaining that the bear had likely moved on to another area or begun preparing for hibernation in the high country. "We'll keep the notice active," he told Sam during a visit in early November, "but at this point, it's unlikely we'll locate this specific bear until spring, if at all." Sam found himself oddly relieved. The thought of the bear being killed because of their encounter had begun to trouble him, a sentiment he hadn't expected to develop. The grizzly had been doing what nature had designed it to do, protecting its territory, responding to perceived threats. The attack hadn't been personal, it had been instinctual. This perspective didn't diminish Sam's wariness. He carried bear spray whenever he ventured beyond the immediate vicinity of the house, and he developed a new habit of scanning his surroundings with a vigilance that hadn't been necessary before. Maggie, too, seemed more alert, her herding instincts now paired with a protectiveness that hadn't been as pronounced before the attack. The first significant snowfall came in mid-November, a week before Thanksgiving. Sam stood at the kitchen window, watching as the heavy flakes transformed the landscape into a winter wonderland. The mountains disappeared behind a curtain of white, and the familiar contours of the ranch took on a softer aspect beneath the growing blanket of snow. Maggie pressed her nose to the glass beside him, equally fascinated by the transformation. The snow brought challenges, frozen water lines to thaw, paths to clear, additional feed for the cattle, but Jake Jenkins proved his worth, arriving early each morning to help with the most physically demanding tasks. Sam found himself appreciating the young man's quiet competence and willingness to learn. At 19, Jake reminded Sam of himself at that age, eager, hardworking, and connected to the land in a way that seemed increasingly rare. "Have you thought about taking on a partner?" Bill asked one afternoon as they watched Jake expertly maneuver the tractor to move a large round bale to the feedlot. "Someone to share the workload permanently, not just during your recovery." Sam had considered it, especially in the dark hours of night when sleep eluded him and the future of the ranch loomed as an unanswered question. "I've thought about it," he admitted, "but finding the right fit isn't easy. It needs to be someone who understands this life, who respects the land and the animals, who's in it for the long haul." Bill nodded thoughtfully, his eyes still on his son. "Jake's heading to Montana State next fall for their ag program. He's talked about wanting to ranch, but he knows it'll be years before he could afford his own place, even with help from me." He glanced at Sam. "Might be worth a conversation is all I'm saying, not now, but down the road." The idea took root in Sam's mind. A partnership with Jake could be beneficial for both of them. Experience and land from Sam, youth and strength from Jake. It wasn't a solution he'd considered before, but as his shoulder continued to heal and the reality of his limitations became clearer, the concept of sharing the ranch responsibilities grew more appealing. Thanksgiving arrived with a flurry of activity. David returned with Katie and the children, filling the house with noise and life that had been absent for too long. Emma, now 6, was fascinated by the ranch and especially by Maggie, who tolerated the child's enthusiastic attention with remarkable patience. 2-year-old Max toddled after his sister, his chubby legs still unsteady on the uneven floorboards of the old farmhouse. The holiday weekend passed in a blur of family meals, board games by the fire, and quiet conversations after the hay. Children were in bed. David and Katie tactfully avoided pressing Sam about his long-term plans for the ranch, but their concern was evident in the way they watched him navigate daily tasks with his still healing shoulder. On the morning they were set to leave, David found Sam in the barn, checking on a pregnant heifer that had been showing signs of discomfort. Maggie lay nearby, her eyes tracking Sam's movements as he examined the young cow. "She looks like she's doing better," Sam said as David approached. "Just normal pre-calving restlessness, I think." David nodded, though his experience with cattle was limited to what he remembered from his childhood on the ranch. "Dad, before we go, I wanted to say something." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I know you're worried about the future of the ranch, about what happens if you can't run it the way you always have." Sam straightened, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his healing shoulder. "I'm making progress. Rachel says I'm ahead of schedule on my recovery." "I know, and that's great," David assured him, "but I want you to know that whatever you decide, whether it's finding a partner like Bill suggested, scaling back operations, or even selling, I support you. This place will always be important to me, to all of us, but not at the cost of your health or happiness." Sam was silent for a moment, touched by his son's understanding. "I'm not ready to give it up," he said finally, "but I'm starting to see that there might be different ways to keep it going, ways I hadn't considered before." He gestured around the barn, at the cattle in their stalls, the equipment he'd maintained meticulously for decades. "This life, this land, it's not just about me, it's about stewardship, about passing something on. Maybe that doesn't have to mean passing it to family. Maybe it just means finding the right hands to care for it next." David smiled, relieved by his father's perspective. "That sounds right to me." He checked his watch. "We should head back to the house. Katie's probably got the kids ready to go and we don't want to miss our flight." As they walked back toward the house, Sam reflected on the conversation. The idea of transitioning the ranch to someone like Jake Jenkins was still just that, an idea, but it felt like a possible path forward, a way to honor the legacy of the Tucker Ranch without clinging too tightly to the past. The weeks following Thanksgiving brought more snow and the bone-deep cold of a Montana winter. Sam's physical therapy continued, his progress steady if slower than he'd hoped. By mid-December, he could raise his left arm to shoulder height, though the movement was accompanied by pain and a grinding sensation from the healing fractures. Rachel assured him this was normal, that the hardware inserted during surgery was doing its job, but the discomfort was a constant reminder of how far he still had to go. Christmas approached with its usual flurry of cards from distant friends, invitations to local gatherings, and the quiet beauty of snow-covered mountains. Sam decorated a small tree, more for his own morale than for show, placing the ornaments Ellen had collected over their years together on the branches with care. Maggie watched the process with interest, occasionally nosing at a low-hanging ball that sparkled in the lamplight. On Christmas Eve, a surprise snowstorm dropped 8 inches of fresh powder, turning the ranch into a scene from a holiday card. Sam woke early, as was his habit, and stood on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching as the first light of dawn illuminated the pristine landscape. Maggie bounded through the untouched snow, leaving a trail of paw prints that meandered across the yard. The stillness of the morning was broken by the sound of tires on the snow-covered drive. Sam looked up, surprised to see Bill Jenkins's truck making its way toward the house. It was barely 6:30, earlier than Bill usually stopped by, even on days when they had work planned. Bill parked and climbed out, his expression serious, as he approached the porch. "Morning, Sam. Sorry to come by so early." "Everything okay?" Sam asked, immediately concerned. In ranch country, unexpected early morning visits often meant trouble, injured livestock, downed fences, or other emergencies. That couldn't wait. Bill stomped the snow from his boots before answering. "Officer Callahan called me about an hour ago. Thought you should know." He paused, his breath creating clouds in the cold air. "They found your bear." Sam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December temperature. "Where?" Up near Cliff Lake, about 15 miles northwest of here. A couple of cross-country skiers spotted it yesterday evening. Fish and Wildlife confirmed it's the same one. Has that scar across the muzzle you described? What happens now? Sam asked, though he already knew the answer. Bill's expression confirmed his thoughts. They tranquilized it. Standard protocol. For a bear that's attacked a human. He didn't need to elaborate, they both knew what that meant. The grizzly would be euthanized, its threat to human safety deemed too great to risk relocation. Sam was surprised by the wave of regret that washed over him. The bear had nearly killed him, had left him with injuries that might never fully heal, yet the thought of its death brought no satisfaction. It was just being a bear, he said quietly. Bill nodded, understanding. Callahan said they'd need you to come in after the holidays to sign some final paperwork. Officially closes the case. After Bill left, promising to return later to help with the day's chores, Sam remained on the porch, his coffee cooling in the mug he still held. Maggie had returned from her exploration of the yard and now sat beside him, pressing against his leg in her familiar way. The news of the bear's fate cast a shadow over the day, though Sam went through the motions of his usual routine, feeding livestock, checking water tanks, preparing for the small gathering he'd planned for the evening. Bill and his family were coming for Christmas Eve dinner, a tradition that had begun after Ellen's death, when they'd recognized that solitary holidays were harder than solitary ordinary days. By the time the Jenkins family arrived, bringing side dishes and desserts to complement the roast Sam had managed to prepare, despite his still limited mobility, he had processed the news about the grizzly and set it aside. The evening unfolded with the comfortable familiarity of longtime neighbors sharing a meal, their conversation ranging from ranch business to local gossip to memories of Christmases past. As they sat around the fire after dinner, Bill's wife, Margaret, asked the question Sam had been expecting for months. "Have you given any more thought to finding a partner for the ranch, Sam? Bill mentioned you two had talked about it." Sam glanced at Bill, who shrugged apologetically. "It's been on my mind," Sam admitted. "The recovery's going well, but Dr. Matthews has been straight with me about the likelihood of permanent limitations. Running this place alone isn't going to be an option, at least not the way I've done it all these years." Jake, who had been quiet for most of the evening, sat forward in his chair. "Mr. Tucker, Dad mentioned you might be considering a partnership arrangement." The young man's expression was earnest, his interest evident. "I'd like to be considered if you're serious about it. I know I'm young and I've got a lot to learn, but I love this land almost as much as our own place." Sam studied Jake, seeing not just Bill's son, but a potential future for the Tucker Ranch. "It would be a big commitment," he said carefully. "College is important, and I wouldn't want to interfere with your education." "Montana State's ag program is designed for working ranchers," Jake replied. "A lot of the students are already running family operations while they study. I could manage both." The conversation continued, moving from the theoretical to the practical, what such a partnership might look like, how it would be structured, the timeline for transition. By the time the Jenkins family departed, heading home through the still-falling snow, a tentative agreement had been reached. Jake would work with Sam through the winter and spring, learning the specifics of the Tucker operation. If both were satisfied with the arrangement, they would formalize a partnership before Jake began college in the fall. As Sam readied himself for bed that night, Maggie already curled in her spot at the foot. He felt a lightness he hadn't experienced. Since before the attack, the path forward wasn't clear or certain, but it existed. The ranch wouldn't be lost, wouldn't be sold to strangers who might not care for it as he had. There would be continuity, a passing of knowledge and responsibility, to hands that valued the land. The final days of December brought more snow and temperatures that hovered near zero. Sam and Jake established a routine, with the young man handling the physically demanding tasks, while Sam supervised and handled what he could with his increasingly mobile but still limited shoulder. They worked well together, Jake's eagerness to learn matched by Sam's willingness to teach. On New Year's Eve, Sam drove into Ennis to sign the final paperwork regarding the bear attack. Officer Callahan met him at the Fish and Wildlife Office, a small room in the back of the county building. The formal documentation was brief: confirmation of the bear's identity, acknowledgement of its euthanization, and closure of the investigation. "It's standard procedure," Callahan explained as Sam read through the papers. "In cases involving human injury, we can't risk relocation. The animal often returns to the same territory or develops a pattern of seeking human contact. Sam signed where indicated, his handwriting still awkward with his left arm in a less restrictive but still necessary brace. "I understand the protocol," he said. "Still seems a waste." Callahan nodded sympathetically. For what it's worth, it was a clean decision. No cubs, no unusual circumstances. Just a territorial male that had begun to associate humans with food sources. He gathered the signed papers. Not all cases are this straightforward. On the drive home, Sam found himself thinking about the grizzly, its power, its primal nature, the way it had looked at him with those intelligent, assessing eyes. The encounter had fundamentally changed his life, altering his physical capabilities and forcing him to reconsider his future. Yet he felt no animosity toward the bear itself, only a respect for the natural forces it represented. The new year brought a gradual thaw, both literal and figurative. January's bitter cold gave way to February's slightly longer days, and Sam's shoulder continued to heal. His range of motion improved, though Rachel cautioned that he would likely never regain full strength or flexibility in the joint. The constant ache became a familiar companion, worse in cold weather or after physical exertion, better on the rare warm days or following his therapy sessions. By March, as the first signs of spring appeared in the greening of the valley and the return of migratory birds, Sam and Jake had settled into a partnership that felt increasingly natural. Jake's knowledge of modern ranching techniques complemented Sam's decades of experience, and they found common ground in their respect for the land and the animals in their care. David and his family visited during spring break, Emma and Max delighting in the muddy adventure of a Montana ranch in March. Sam watched his grandchildren chase Hallmark. "I feel more like myself," he acknowledged. "Still have bad days, still have pain, but I'm finding my way back." "And the partnership with Jake? That's working out?" "Better than I expected," Sam replied. "He's young, but he's got good instincts and a willingness to learn. Reminds me a bit of your grandfather when he was teaching me the ropes." He glanced at David. "I know it's not the same as keeping the ranch in the family, but it feels right." David placed a hand on his father's good shoulder. "It is right, Dad. This place will still be the Tucker Ranch, still be the place where I grew up, where my kids can visit and learn what matters. That's what's important, not whose name is on the deed." The calving season began in April, bringing the usual mix of exhaustion and exhilaration as new life arrived on the ranch. Sam found he could handle many of the tasks involved, though he relied on Jake for the more physically demanding aspects. Maggie proved invaluable, her herding skills keeping anxious mother cows in check while Sam and Jake tended to the newborns. On a warm morning in late April, almost exactly 7 months after the attack, Sam rose before dawn as usual. His shoulder ached with the promise of rain later in the day, but he moved with a comfort that had been absent for months. Maggie followed him onto the porch, her tail wagging as she surveyed the pre-dawn landscape. "Let's check the north pasture," Sam said, the words coming naturally despite the memories they evoked. Maggie looked up at him, head tilted as though asking if he was certain. "It's time, girl," he assured her, scratching behind her ears. They walked together toward his truck, Sam's pace slower than it had been before the attack, a slight limp evident when he was tired or the weather turned. He carried bear spray in his pocket, a habit he would likely never abandon, and his eyes scanned the tree line with an awareness that had become second nature. As they drove toward the north pasture, the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Sam parked near the gate where he'd struggled to pull himself into the truck 7 months earlier, his blood staining the ground beneath him. Today the spot looked like any other. Grass growing, wildlife tracks in the soft earth, no visible reminder of the life-altering event that had occurred there. Sam opened the gate and stepped through, Maggie trotting ahead but staying closer than she once would have. The herd of pregnant heifers, a new group ready to calve in the coming weeks, grazed peacefully in the distance. Sam walked slowly into the pasture, his boots leaving imprints in the dew-covered grass. He stopped at approximately the spot where the attack had happened, where teeth and claws had torn into his flesh and changed the course of his life. There was nothing to mark it, no memorial, no physical evidence of the struggle that had occurred. Only Sam's memories and the scars on his body provided testimony to what had happened here. Maggie circled back to him, pressing against his leg, as she often did now, her brown eyes watching his face with an intelligence that sometimes seemed almost human. Sam reached down to stroke her head, feeling the softness of her fur beneath his fingers. "You saved my life that day, Maggie," he said quietly. The words meant only for the dog. "I wouldn't be standing here if not for you." Maggie wagged her tail, accepting the praise as her due. In the distance, the cattle continued their peaceful grazing, unaware of the significance this place held for the man and dog watching them. The sun cleared the horizon, casting long shadows across the pasture and illuminating the mountains to the west in golden light. Sam took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool morning air. The north pasture was just a pasture again, a piece of land where his cattle grazed, where he worked, where life continued. The bear was gone, his wounds were healing, and the future of the ranch was taking shape in a way he hadn't anticipated, but now embraced. With Maggie at his heel, Sam turned and walked back toward the gate, his limp barely noticeable in the soft earth. Today was just another day on the Tucker Ranch, cattle to check, fences to mend, a partnership to nurture. The attack had changed him, marked him physically and emotionally, but it hadn't defined him. That choice remained his own. As Sam and Maggie reached the gate, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its sharp cry echoing across the pasture. Sam paused to watch its flight, the bird's wings catching the morning sunlight as it rode the thermal currents. Life in all its forms continued here, following the ancient rhythms of nature. Birth and death, predator and prey, man and wilderness coexisting in a balance as old as the mountains themselves. Sam closed the gate. Behind him, securing it with the latch that had once nearly defeated his blood-slick fingers, Maggie jumped into the truck ahead of him, taking her customary place on the passenger seat. As Sam climbed in beside her and started the engine, he felt a sense of completion, of a circle closing. He had confronted his fear by returning to this place, by reclaiming it not as the site of trauma, but as part of the ranch he loved. The truck bumped along the familiar road back toward the house, where Jake would be arriving soon to begin the day's work. Maggie sat alert beside him, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape, ever watchful for anything out of place. Sam drove with the windows down, letting the morning air fill the cab, carrying with it the scents of grass, pine, and cattle, the smells of home. The grizzly that had attacked him was gone, but others would take its place in these mountains, continuing their ancient dance with the human inhabitants of the valley. Sam would always carry the memory of that September morning, would always bear the scars of teeth and claws, would always know how quickly life could change, but he would also carry the knowledge that he had survived, had adapted, had found a way forward when the path seemed most uncertain. As the house came into view, framed by the mountains beyond, Sam felt a profound gratitude for Maggie's courage, for his family's support, for the resilience that had seen him through. The border. Collie beside him was more than a good working dog now. She was his guardian, his companion in survival, a living reminder of both the fragility and tenacity of life. Sam reached over to stroke Maggie's head, feeling the softness of her fur beneath his scarred fingers. "Let's go home, girl," he said. Quietly and together they continued down the road, toward the future that awaited them. Now let's move on to the story of the next survivor. The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering pine trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, where the Green family had gathered for their annual reunion. Michigan's Upper Peninsula was a favorite spot for the extended family, offering mother's boundless energy and curiosity. He clutched his favorite blue sippy cup filled with apple juice, taking periodic sips as he watched his older cousins play tag around the fire pit. "Lucas, stay where we can see you," Sarah called, noticing her son's eager gaze following his cousins. At 3, Lucas was fiercely independent, always trying to keep up with the older children despite his toddler limitations. "I will, Mommy," Lucas replied, though his attention had already shifted to a butterfly landing on the wooden railing beside him. The Green family reunion was always organized by Michael's parents, Gerald and Martha Green, who had started the tradition 26 years ago when their 5 children were still young. Now those children had families of their own, and the reunion had grown into a sprawling 3-day event filled with barbecues, swimming, hiking, and catching up on the past year's events. "Hey, little man," a booming voice called as a tall, bearded man approached the cabin. "You ready for some adventure this weekend?" Lucas's face lit up at the sight of his Uncle Jake, his father's youngest brother and his favorite relative. At 32, Jake was the family's eternal bachelor and adventure seeker, always arriving with stories of his latest expeditions and pockets full of treats for his nieces and nephews. "Uncle Jake," Lucas squealed, abandoning his spot on the porch to race toward his uncle, juice sloshing in his cup. Jake scooped the boy up and spun him around, eliciting peals of laughter. "I brought something special for tonight," he said conspiratorially, setting Lucas back on his feet and crouching to his level. "Fireworks, the good kind. But don't tell Grandma, okay? It's our secret." Lucas nodded solemnly, though the concept of a secret was still somewhat abstract to his 3-year-old mind. Still, he understood that Uncle Jake's surprises were always worth keeping quiet about. Sarah approached, smiling at her brother-in-law. "Don't go filling his head with crazy ideas, Jake. Last time, he tried to fish in the bathtub for a week. After you taught him to cast a line." Jake laughed, standing to give Sarah a quick hug. "That's what uncles are for, right? Causing trouble and then heading home before the real fallout." Michael joined them, carrying the last of their bags from the car. "And what trouble are you planning this year?" he asked, clapping his brother on the shoulder. "Nothing that'll get me banned from future reunions," Jake assured him with a wink. "Just a little nighttime entertainment." The brothers fell into easy conversation, while Sarah checked her watch. "Hey, it's almost time for the welcome barbecue. Lucas, let's get you changed into a clean shirt." But Lucas had already wandered a few steps away, fascinated by an ant hill at the edge of the clearing. The tiny creatures marched in orderly lines, carrying crumbs and small bits of leaves back to their colony. Lucas crouched down, his juice cup forgotten on the ground beside him, little fingers reaching out to touch the moving insects. "Lucas, don't touch," Sarah called, noticing her son's fascination. "Ants can bite." Reluctantly, Lucas stood up, retrieving his juice cup and trotting back to his mother's side. His blue dinosaur t-shirt was already smudged with dirt, a testament to the 3 minutes he'd been out of the car. The rest of the afternoon passed in a flurry of greetings, hugs, and the controlled chaos that comes with nearly 40 people, gathering in one place. The older cousins organized a kickball game in the clearing, while the adults set up tables for dinner and caught up on family news. Lucas stayed close to his parents, occasionally venturing to play with his cousin Emma, who at 5 years old had been assigned the role of watching the little kids, a responsibility she took very seriously. As evening approached, the smell of grilling burgers and hot dogs filled the air. Gerald Green, the family patriarch, manned the large grill with practiced ease, spatula in one hand and a can of beer in the other. At 68, he was still robust and energetic, his hair more salt than pepper, but his laugh as hearty as ever. "Dinner in 10 minutes, Martha announced, arranging plates of sliced tomatoes, lettuce, and condiments on the long picnic tables. "Someone round up the kids." Sarah did a quick head count of the youngest children playing near the cabins. "Where's Lucas?" she asked, not seeing her son among the small group. "He was just here," Emma said, looking around with a slight furrow in her brow. "He was playing with his trucks." Sarah felt the first prickle of concern. "Lucas," she called, scanning the clearing. "Lucas, time for dinner." Several other adults turned at the sound of Sarah's increasingly urgent calls. Michael abandoned his conversation with his brothers and joined the search, walking toward the cabins where the children had been playing. "He probably just went to the bathroom," Michael said, though his pace quickened as he checked their cabin. "Lucas, buddy, you in here?" The cabin was empty. Michael's heart rate picked up slightly as he checked under the beds and in the small bathroom. He's not here," he called to Sarah as he emerged. By now, several family members had joined the search, calling Lucas's name as they checked the other cabins, behind trees at the edge of the clearing and around the parked cars. Jake approached. Sarah, concern etched on his usually carefree face. "When did you last see him?" "Maybe 20 minutes ago. He was playing with his trucks near our cabin." Sarah's voice had taken on a tight quality, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. As she spoke, "He wouldn't just wander off, he knows better." But even as she said it, Sarah knew that Lucas's curiosity often overrode his caution. He was at that age where the world was one big exploration, and danger was an abstract concept that didn't really apply to him. "Let's organize properly," Gerald said, taking charge of the situation. "We'll split into groups and check all the cabins again, then the bathrooms, then expand outward. He can't have gone far." Martha put her arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Don't worry, dear. Children this age hide sometimes. He's probably fallen. So sleep under a bed or found a cozy spot to play." But as the minutes ticked by and the search expanded with no sign of Lucas, Sarah's anxiety blossomed into full-blown fear. Michael's face had gone pale, his movements becoming more frantic as he called his son's name. "I'm going to check the lake," Jake said, already jogging toward the water's edge, giving voice to the fear no one wanted to acknowledge, that a 3-year-old near water could mean tragedy. Just then, one of the teenage cousins came running from the edge of the forest. "I found something," she called, holding up a small blue object. "It's Lucas's juice cup." Sarah's heart dropped as she recognized the sippy cup her son had been carrying all afternoon. The cousin pointed toward a barely visible trail leading into the woods. It was just at the start of the hiking trail. Michael was already moving, Sarah right behind him. "Lucas," he shouted, his voice echoing among the trees. "Lucas, can you hear me?" The forest was beginning to darken as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The tall pines created deep shadows, and the temperature was noticeably cooler under the dense canopy. The trail was narrow but clear, winding through the underbrush and occasionally marked with small wooden signs. "He must have followed the trail," Michael said, his voice tight with fear. "Why would he go into the woods alone?" Sarah didn't answer, her eyes scanning every shadow, every bush, looking for any sign of her son's bright blue t-shirt among the greens and browns of the forest. Jake caught up with them, slightly out of breath. "Gerald's calling the park rangers," he said. "They'll get a proper search organized if we don't find him soon." "We have to find him before dark," Sarah said, her voice cracking. The Upper Peninsula wilderness was not a place for a toddler to be alone after nightfall, with temperatures that could drop significantly and wildlife that became more active in the evening hours. They continued along the trail, calling Lucas's name every few steps, straining to hear any response. The forest sounds, birds calling, leaves rustling, the distant lapping of lake waves, seemed to mock their increasing desperation. About a quarter-mile from the cabins, the trail forked. One path continued straight, while another narrower track veered to the left. "Let's split up," Michael suggested. "Jake, you take the left fork. Sarah and I will continue straight." Jake nodded, pulling out his phone to use as a flashlight in the dimming light. "Call if you find anything," he said, already moving down the left path, his voice joining theirs in calling for Lucas. Sarah and Michael continued along the main trail, their calls growing more urgent as the light faded further. Sarah tried to fight back the images flooding her mind. Lucas afraid and alone in the dark. Lucas hurt from a fall. Lucas encountering one of the many wild animals that inhabited these woods. "Wait," Michael said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. "Listen." They stood still, barely breathing, and then they heard it, a small, hiccuping cry coming from somewhere off the trail to their right. "Lucas," Sarah called, her voice breaking with hope and fear. "Lucas, is that you, baby?" The crying continued, definitely a child's sobs. Michael was already pushing through the underbrush toward the sound, Sarah right behind him. They scrambled over fallen logs and pushed past scratching branches, following the sound of their son's cries. They emerged into a small clearing, and there, sitting on a fallen log about 20 yards away, was Lucas. His blue t-shirt was dirty, his face tear-streaked, and he was holding his arm against his chest. But he was alive. "Lucas!" Sarah cried, rushing toward him, but something made Michael grab her arm, stopping her mid-stride. "Sarah, wait," he said, his voice low and tense. And then she saw it. A black bear, medium-sized but still imposing, was standing at the far edge of the clearing, perhaps 30 feet from Lucas. The bear's head was raised, nostrils flaring as it scented the air, obviously aware of the human's arrival. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Black bears weren't usually aggressive toward humans, but a surprised bear or one that felt cornered could be dangerous. And Lucas, small and crying, was sitting directly between them and the animal. "Lucas," Michael called, keeping his voice calm despite the terror gripping his chest. "Lucas, buddy, don't move. Stay right where you are." Lucas looked up, his crying momentarily halted by the sound of his father's voice. "Daddy," he called, his small voice quavering. "Daddy, bear hurted me." The realization that the bear had already made contact with their son sent a fresh wave of fear through both parents. Now they could see that Lucas's arm had scratch marks, and there was a tear in his t-shirt. The bear was still watching them, its dark eyes unreadable. It hadn't fled at their approach, which was concerning. Most black bears would avoid human confrontation if given the chance. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on her son sitting vulnerable and alone. Michael's mind raced through everything he'd ever heard about bear encounters. Make yourself look big. Make noise. Don't run. But all of that advice seemed useless with Lucas sitting directly in the potential path between them and the bear. "Call Jake," Michael whispered, slowly pulling out his phone without making any sudden movements. "Tell him where we are and about the bear. Tell him to bring help but to approach quietly." Sarah took the phone with trembling hands, her eyes never leaving Lucas as she dialed her brother-in-law. She whispered their situation and location, barely able to keep her voice steady. The bear had started to move, taking a few steps along the edge of the clearing, still watching them. Lucas, sensing something was wrong, began to cry again, his sobs cutting through the evening air. "Lucas, it's okay, buddy," Michael called, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "We're going to come get you. Just stay still for a minute, okay? I want Mommy," Lucas cried, his little body shaking with sobs. The bear's head swung toward the crying child, and it took a step in Lucas's direction. Sarah bit back a scream, her entire body tensing to run to her son despite the danger. Michael held her arm firmly. "We have to be smart about this," he whispered. "If we rush in, the bear might attack." "It's already hurt him," Sarah hissed, her maternal instinct screaming at her to protect her child. "I know, but it didn't. It could have been worse. It didn't maul him. We need to give it a way out." The bear took another step toward Lucas, who was now crying harder, his little shoulders shaking. The animal seemed more curious than aggressive, but with a wild predator, that distinction offered little comfort. Just then, a loud bang echoed through the clearing, followed by a shower of red sparks from the trees to their left. The bear's head jerked toward the sound, its body tensing. Another bang, louder this time, and a burst of blue light illuminated the darkening clearing. Jake emerged from the trees, a lit firework in one hand and his backpack, presumably containing more, in the other. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice booming through the clearing. "Get away from him!" The bear huffed, taking a step back from the noise and light. Jake lit another firework, this one shooting straight up into the air before exploding in a cascade of golden sparks. The bear turned and lumbered quickly toward the trees, disappearing into the forest with surprising speed for an animal its size. The moment the bear was out of sight, Sarah broke free from Michael's grip and ran to Lucas, scooping him into her arms and holding him tight against her chest. "Baby, baby, are you okay?" she cried, tears streaming down her face as she checked him for injuries. Lucas's left arm had 3 long scratches, not deep, but definitely breaks in the skin. His t-shirt was torn at the shoulder, and there was a small cut on his cheek. But he was alive, and beyond the obvious scratches appeared unharmed. The bear was scary, Lucas sobbed into his mother's shoulder. "I wanted my juice, but the bear was there." Michael reached them, wrapping his arms around both Sarah and Lucas, his whole body shaking with relief and residual fear. "You're okay, buddy, you're okay now." Jake approached cautiously, scanning the trees for any sign of the bear's return. "We need to get back to the cabins," he said. "Black bears don't usually attack humans, but that one was too comfortable around people. It could come back." Michael nodded, taking Lucas from Sarah's arms. "Let's go. We need to get his scratches cleaned and call the rangers." They moved quickly but carefully back to the trail, Jake bringing up the rear and occasionally glancing behind them. Lucas had stopped crying and now clung to his father's neck, his little body occasionally hiccuping with the aftermath of his sobs. "What happened, Lucas?" Sarah asked gently as they walked, needing to understand how her son had ended up alone, in the clearing. "Why did you go into the woods?" "I saw a bunny," Lucas said, his voice small. "It was fluffy. I followed it." The simple explanation, so typical of a curious 3-year-old, made Sarah's knees weak with the realization of how easily this could have happened. One moment of distraction, one interesting creature catching her son's eye, and he was gone. "Then I couldn't find you," Lucas continued, his voice catching. "And I was scared. And then the bear came." "Did the bear hurt you right away?" Michael asked, trying to understand the encounter. Lucas shook his head. "It was eating berries. I said hello to it. Then it looked at me and made a loud noise. I got scared and fell down, then it touched me with its paw." Sarah exchanged a glance with Michael over Lucas's head. The bear had swiped at their son, a warning rather than a full attack, but terrifying nonetheless. "You were very brave," Jake said, ruffling Lucas's hair from behind, "and smart to stay in one place so we could find you." By the time they reached the cabins, Gerald had already contacted the park rangers who were en route. The family gathered anxiously around as Michael and Sarah, sending most of the family back to their cabins, and asking Michael's sister Eleanor, a registered nurse, to come help with Lucas. Inside the cabin, Eleanor examined Lucas's scratches carefully. "They're not deep," she said, gently cleaning the wounds with antiseptic. "But any wild animal scratch carries risk of infection. He should get a rabies assessment at a hospital, just to be safe." Lucas whimpered as the antiseptic stung, clinging to Sarah, who held him on her lap. "It's okay, baby," she soothed, her own hand still trembling slightly. "This will make it better." Michael paced the small cabin, alternating between relief that his son was safe and anger at himself for not watching more carefully. "I should have been paying closer attention," he said, running a hand through his hair. He was right there and then. "13 kids this age are quick," Elena said, applying antibiotic ointment to Lucas's arm, "and curious. You can't blame yourself." A knock at the door announced the arrival of the park rangers. 2 uniformed officers entered, expressions serious. As they took in the scene, "I'm Ranger Wilson, and this is Ranger Malik." The taller of the two introduced themselves. "We understand there was a bear encounter with a child." Michael nodded, explaining what had happened, Lucas wandering off, their search, finding him in the clearing with the bear, and Jake's use of fireworks to scare the animal away. "Did you notice any unusual behavior from the bear?" Ranger Wilson asked, taking notes. "Was it tagged or marked in any way?" Sarah shook her head. "We were too focused on Lucas to notice details like that. It didn't run away immediately when we arrived, which seemed strange." "That's concerning," Ranger Malik said. "Black bears are usually shy around humans. One that's comfortable approaching. A child or that doesn't immediately flee, when adults arrive, might be habituated to people. Maybe it's been finding food at campgrounds or cabins." "Is that dangerous?" Martha asked from where she stood near the... "It can be," Wilson nodded. "Bears that associate humans with food can become problems. They lose their natural wariness and are more likely to approach populated areas." The ranger then turned to examine Lucas's scratches, which Elena had finished bandaging. "These don't look too serious, but he should definitely be seen by a doctor. Animal scratches can get infected easily, and there's a protocol for potential rabies exposure, though it's rare in bears. We'll take him to the emergency room in Marquette," Michael said. "It's about an hour from here." "Good idea," Wilson agreed. "We'll need to file a report about the incident and the bear. This area of the UP has a healthy black bear population, but attacks on humans are very rare. We'll need to investigate whether this is a bear that needs to be relocated." The word relocated hung in the air, everyone understanding the unspoken alternative, that a bear deemed too dangerous might be euthanized. "It didn't really attack him," Sarah said quietly, stroking Lucas's hair as he dozed against her shoulder, exhausted from his ordeal. "It just scratched him. Lucas said it was eating berries when he approached." Wilson nodded. "That's good to know. Black bears are primarily foragers, not hunters of large prey. Most encounters with humans are defensive, not predatory. Still, we need to assess the situation." After taking detailed statements from everyone involved and examining the site on a map, the rangers prepared to leave. "We'll be back in the morning to check the area where you saw the bear," Ranger Malik said. "In the meantime, make sure everyone stays together, especially the children. Make noise when you're outside so you don't surprise any wildlife, and keep all food secured in the cabins or cars." As the rangers left, Gerald addressed the family members who had gathered anxiously outside. "Lucas is going to be fine," he announced, his voice steady despite the worry lines creasing his forehead. "Michael and Sarah are taking him to the hospital in Marquette as a precaution. The rest of us will stay here, but everyone needs to be extra careful. No wandering off, especially the children." Jake approached Michael as he prepared to drive his family to the hospital. "I'm sorry about the fireworks," he said quietly. "I know they're not allowed in the park, but..." Michael cut him off with a fierce hug. "Your illegal fireworks saved my son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't apologize for that. Ever." The drive to UP Health System, Marquette, took just over an hour, with Lucas sleeping most of the way in his car seat, occasionally whimpering when the car hit a bump. Sarah sat beside him in the back, unwilling to let him out of her sight, while Michael drove with tense concentration, the events of the evening replaying in his mind. The emergency room was relatively quiet when they arrived, and a pediatric doctor examined Lucas promptly. After cleaning the wounds more thoroughly and applying proper dressings, the doctor confirmed Elena's assessment. The scratches aren't deep enough to require stitches, she explained, but we do need to treat them as potential rabies exposures, even though rabies is extremely rare in bears in this region. What does that mean? Sarah asked, holding Lucas on her lap as the doctor finished bandaging his arm. We'll start him on a preventative regimen today, an immunoglobulin shot and the first dose of the rabies vaccine. You'll need to follow up for the remaining doses over the next 2 weeks. Lucas, who had been brave throughout the examination, began to cry at the mention of shots. No shots, he protested, burrowing against his mother. I know, buddy, Michael said, kneeling beside him, but these are special medicine to make sure you stay healthy. You've been so brave already. After the injections, which Lucas endured, with tears but surprising stoicism for a 3-year-old, the doctor gave them care instructions for the wounds and a schedule for the follow-up rabies vaccines. Keep the scratches clean and watch for any signs of infection, redness, swelling, increased pain or discharge, she advised, and he might be a bit sore from the shots for a day or two. It was past midnight when they finally returned to Pine Ridge Resort. Lucas had fallen asleep again in the car, emotionally and physically drained from his ordeal. The cabins were dark except for the soft glow of a lamp left on in their own cabin, where Martha waited anxiously for their return. Everything okay? She whispered, as Michael carried the sleeping Lucas to the small bedroom. Sarah nodded wearily. The scratches will heal. He needed rabies shots as a precaution, and we'll have to go back for more. But the doctor wasn't too concerned. Martha hugged her daughter-in-law tightly. You must be exhausted, dear. Get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning. But despite her exhaustion, Sarah found sleep elusive. She lay beside Lucas in the small bed, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, her mind replaying the image of her son sitting vulnerable and alone with a wild bear nearby. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bear moving toward Lucas, imagined what might have happened if Jake hadn't arrived with his fireworks, if the bear had been more aggressive, if they had found Lucas a few minutes later. Michael seemed equally unable to sleep, tossing and turning on the other side of Lucas. Eventually he got up and moved to the cabin's small front porch. Sarah joined him a few minutes later, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cool night air. I can't stop thinking about what could have happened, Michael said softly, as Sarah sat beside him on the wooden bench. If that bear had decided to really attack him. I know, Sarah whispered, leaning against his shoulder, but it didn't. He's safe. He's sleeping inside with just some scratches. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the forest and the distant lapping of lake waves. The stars were brilliant in the clear upper peninsula sky, the Milky Way a smudge of light across the darkness. I don't think I want to come back here, Sarah said finally. Not next year. Maybe not ever. Michael nodded slowly. I was thinking. So the same thing. Maybe it's time for a new family reunion tradition, somewhere without bears. A beach, Sarah suggested. Somewhere with just sand and waves and lifeguards. The idea of a beach vacation, open sightlines, no large predators, trained safety personnel, sounded like paradise after the events of the day. They returned to bed eventually, both managing a few hours of restless sleep before Lucas woke them at dawn, his arm sore from the shots and scratches, but his spirits remarkably recovered. Can I have pancakes? He asked, seemingly untroubled by his adventure of the previous day. The resilience of children, Sarah thought as she helped Lucas get dressed, carefully avoiding the bandages on his arm. One day a bear attack, the next day pancakes. News of the incident had spread quickly among the resort staff and other guests. As the Greens made their way to the main lodge for breakfast, what happens now? She asked. The rangers have set up humane traps in the area. If they catch the bear, they'll tag it and relocate it to a more remote region. They've also asked me to remind everyone about proper food storage and disposal. All trash needs to go in the bear-proof containers, and no food should be left outside, even temporarily. After breakfast, Ranger Wilson returned to take additional statements and photographs of Lucas's injuries for their report. We'll probably never know for certain if we caught the specific bear involved, she explained, but we need to document the incident thoroughly either way. Lucas, who had been shy around the ranger at first, gradually warmed up to her and proudly showed off his bandages. The bear was big, he told her, holding his arms wide, and it said, "Ray." The ranger smiled gently. That must have been scary, she said. You were very brave. Uncle Jake made the bear go away with boom booms, Lucas added, his eyes lighting up at the memory of the fireworks. Ranger Wilson's smile tightened slightly at the mention of fireworks in the state forest, but she didn't comment on the illegal use of pyrotechnics that had likely saved the boy from worse injury. The rest of the day passed in a subdued fashion. Many of the planned activities, hiking, berry picking, a scavenger hunt in the woods, were cancelled in light of the bear sighting. The children were restricted to the immediate vicinity of the cabins, with adults keeping constant watch. The carefree atmosphere of previous reunions had been replaced by a tense vigilance. By evening, the rangers had set up 3 traps in the area around the clearing where Lucas had encountered the bear, baited with sweet foods that attract bears, but placed well away from the cabins. The traps were designed to safely capture the animal for relocation. We've also installed trail cameras, Ranger Malik explained during his check-in with the family. If the bear returns to the area, we'll at least get some footage of it. That will help us identify whether it's a bear we've had problems with before. The planned bonfire and s'mores night went ahead, but with a subdued atmosphere. Jake's fireworks display, which had been a surprise planned for the reunion, had been used up in driving away the bear. Lucas, who should have been in bed, was allowed to stay up, unwilling to leave his parents' sides. He sat on Michael's lap, pointing out constellations that his father had taught him, seemingly untroubled by his bandaged arm. "Kids are amazing," Gerald said, watching his grandson. "Such capacity for recovery." Martha nodded, though her eyes revealed her lingering worry. It's the adults who carry the fear forward. The night passed uneventfully, and by morning, news came that one of the traps had been triggered. A medium-sized male black bear had been captured. Whether it was the same bear that had encountered Lucas was impossible to determine with certainty, but it was the right size and found in the same area. Several family members, including Michael and Jake, went with the rangers to observe from a distance as the tranquilized bear was examined, tagged, and prepared for relocation. "He's about 3 years old," Ranger Wilson explained, as they watched her colleague check the unconscious animal's teeth and overall condition, probably on his own for the first time this year, looking for territory. The bear would be relocated to a remote area of the Ottawa National Forest, far from campgrounds and cabins, where natural food sources were plentiful and human interaction unlikely. Lucas watched with big eyes from the safety of Sarah's arms as the rangers loaded the tranquilized bear into their truck. "Is the bear going to jail?" he asked. Sarah smiled despite herself. "No, honey. The bear is going to a new home. In the forest, far away from people." "Because it was bad?" Sarah hesitated, looking to Michael for help explaining the complexities of wildlife management to a 3-year-old. "The bear wasn't bad, buddy," Michael said, taking Lucas from Sarah's arms. "Bears are wild animals. They're just doing what bears do, looking for food, protecting themselves. But this bear learned that people might have food which can be dangerous for both bears and people. So the rangers are taking it somewhere it can be a proper wild bear away from people." Lucas considered this explanation seriously. "The bear hurted me," he said, touching his bandaged arm, "but I was in his house, in the forest." Sarah's heart ached at her son's attempt to make sense of what had happened. "That's right, sweetie. The forest is the bear's home. That's why we need to be careful and respectful when we visit the forest." The final day of the reunion was subdued as everyone packed to leave. What normally would have been a day of last-minute swimming, hiking, and games became a quiet day of cabin cleaning and goodbyes. The incident with Lucas had cast a shadow over the gathering, reminding everyone of the thin line between enjoyable wilderness experiences and the real dangers that wild places could pose. As they loaded their car for the drive home, Jake approached with a small wooden carving of a bear. "I got this in town this morning," he said, handing it to Lucas, "so you can remember how brave you were." Lucas took the carving with interest, turning it over in his small hands. "It's like my bear," he said, "but smaller." Jake laughed, tousling his nephew's hair. "Much smaller and safer." Sarah watched the interaction with mixed emotions. Part of her wanted Lucas to forget the entire incident, to not have the memory of the fear and pain. But another part recognized that this experience, though traumatic, had also been formative. Lucas had shown remarkable courage and resilience, qualities that would serve him well in life. "Thank you," she said to Jake, giving her brother-in-law a hug. "For everything." Jake nodded. Understanding the depth of her gratitude went far beyond the small carving. "See you at Christmas?" he asked. Definitely, Michael answered. Though maybe we should reconsider camping next summer. Jake grinned. Beach vacation? I could teach Lucas to surf. Sarah groaned. Let's get through this adventure before you plan the next one. The drive home was long, with Lucas alternating between naps and playing with his toys in the back seat. His arm was healing well, the scratches already beginning to scab over properly. They had an appointment scheduled with their pediatrician for the next day to check the wounds and continue the rabies vaccination series. As they drove through the Michigan countryside, Sarah found herself watching the passing forests with new eyes. The beautiful wilderness that had always seemed welcoming now held a hint of threat, a reminder of its indifference to human presence. She wondered if she would ever feel completely comfortable in the woods again, if she would ever be able to let Lucas explore nature without the shadow of fear hanging over her. "What are you thinking?" Michael asked, noticing her pensive expression. "About nature," she said. "About how quickly things can change." Michael reached over to squeeze her hand. "We can't protect him from everything," he said softly, voicing the fear they both shared. "No matter how much we want to." "I know," Sarah sighed, "but we can choose our battles, and maybe bears don't need to be one of them for a while." When they arrived home the following evening, their modest suburban house seemed like a safe haven. The neat lawn, paved driveway, and familiar surroundings offered a comforting contrast to the wild uncertainty of the forest. Lucas, excited to be home, immediately wanted to tell their neighbor's daughter, his playmate Lily, about his adventure. Sarah listened as he recounted his tale with the dramatic embellishments typical of a 3-year-old, the bear growing slightly larger with each telling, the encounter more exciting than frightening in his retelling. "Mommy was scared," he told Lily, "but I was brave and Uncle Jake made big booms to scare the bear." Lily's mother, Ellen, raised her eyebrows at Sarah. "Bear?" she asked. Sarah nodded, pulling up her sleeve to show the bandages on Lucas's arm. "Black bear in the Upper Peninsula. He wandered off during the family reunion and had a close encounter." Ellen's eyes widened. "My God, Sarah, was it... how bad?" "It could have been much worse," Sarah said, the relief and residual fear evident in her voice. "The bear just swiped at him, a warning," the rangers said. "If it had wanted to really hurt him..." She trailed off, unwilling to voice the possibilities that had haunted her thoughts. "That's terrifying," Ellen said, instinctively placing a protective hand on her own daughter's shoulder. "Will he be okay?" Sarah watched Lucas demonstrating to Lily how the bear had growled, his little face scrunched up in an attempt at ferocity. "Physically, yes, the scratches are healing well. Emotionally," she shrugged. "Kids are resilient. He seems more excited than traumatized right now." "And you? How are you doing?" The simple question brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. Throughout the ordeal, she had been focused entirely on Lucas, his physical injuries, his emotional state, his safety. No one had really asked how. She was processing the event. "I'm managing," she said, blinking back the tears. "It's hitting me in waves. One minute I'm fine, the next I'm imagining all the ways it could have gone differently." Ellen hugged her tightly. "That's normal. You went through something traumatic too. Be gentle with yourself." The next few weeks brought a gradual return to routine. Lucas's scratches healed well, leaving 3 faint pink lines on his arm that the doctor assured them would likely fade significantly over time. They completed the series of rabies vaccinations without incident, though each visit to the clinic brought back memories of that night in the emergency room. Lucas had 3 nightmares about bears in the weeks following the incident, waking up crying and calling for his parents. But as summer transitioned to fall, these became less frequent. His pediatrician suggested a few sessions with a child psychologist specializing in trauma, but after an initial assessment, the psychologist felt Lucas was processing the event healthily. "He's incorporating the experience into his understanding of the world in an age-appropriate way," she explained to Michael and Sarah. "He's not showing signs of persistent trauma or phobia. The occasional nightmare is normal after such an event." What did persist was Lucas's fascination with bears. His favorite books became those featuring bears, whether realistic nature books or fictional stories with bear characters. He drew pictures of bears, simple childish scribbles that gradually took on more recognizable bear-like shapes, and added bears to his imaginative play scenarios, though always as characters to be respected and somewhat feared rather than purely as threats. For Michael and Sarah, the psychological impact lasted longer. Sarah found herself checking on Lucas multiple times during the night, needing the reassurance of seeing him safe in his bed. Michael became hyper-vigilant during outings to parks or even their backyard, constantly scanning for potential dangers. "I know it's irrational," he admitted to Sarah one evening as they watched Lucas playing in their fenced backyard. "We're in suburban Michigan. There are no bears here, but I can't help it." "It's not irrational," Sarah replied. "It's protective. We experienced something that reminded us how vulnerable he is, how vulnerable we all are. It's natural to be more cautious afterward." The annual planning for the next year's Green family reunion began in January, as it always did. Gerald and Martha sent out their usual email asking for location suggestions, but with a notable new criterion: easily accessible, family-friendly, and preferably without large wildlife concerns. Various family members replied with suggestions: a lakeside resort in Wisconsin, cabins in the Smoky Mountains, a dude ranch in Colorado. But it was Sarah's suggestion that garnered the most enthusiasm: a beach house rental on the Gulf Coast of Florida. "No bears," she wrote in her proposal, "just sand, surf, and a gated community with security, plus activities for all ages and plenty of space for everyone." The vote was nearly unanimous. After 27 years of wilderness-focused reunions, the Green family was ready for a change. Only Jake voiced mild disappointment, though he tempered it with humor. "Fine, but I'm bringing my fishing gear, and does anyone know if there are alligators in that part of Florida?" As spring arrived, Lucas's third birthday passed, and the 80th anniversary of the bear encounter approached. Sarah noticed her anxiety increasing again. The vivid memories of that night in the forest, finding Lucas with the bear, the hospital visit, the sleepless nights afterward, seemed fresher in her mind. "Do you think about it much?" she asked Michael one night after Lucas was asleep. "The bear?" Michael nodded slowly. "More than I expected to this much later, especially when I see the scars on his arm. They're fading, but they're still there," Sarah finished. "Reminders." "I had a weird thought today," Michael admitted. "Neat. I was thinking about the family reunion, about going to Florida instead of back to the UP, and I felt guilty, like we're letting the bear win." Sarah considered this. "I don't think it's about winning or losing. It's about choosing our exposures. To risk, especially for Lucas. He'll have plenty of opportunities to experience wilderness when he's older and more aware of the dangers." "You're right," Michael sighed. "It's just, I grew up with those UP summers. They're some of my best childhood memories. I wanted Lucas to have that too." "He will have wonderful memories," Sarah assured him. "Just different ones. Beach memories instead of forest memories. And maybe when he's older we can try the forest again, when he can understand guidelines and stay close." The weeks leading up to the first anniversary of the incident brought an unexpected development. A local newspaper from the Upper Peninsula contacted them, interested in doing a follow-up story on the bear encounter. Apparently, the reporter had come across the incident report while researching an article on human-wildlife interactions in Michigan state parks. "I'm not sure how I feel about that," Sarah said after hanging up from the call. "Revisiting it, all for a newspaper article." "What did you tell them?" Michael asked. "That I'd discuss it with you and get back to them." They debated the pros and cons that evening. On one hand, sharing their experience might help other families be more vigilant about children in bear country. On the other hand, it meant publicly reliving a traumatic event and potentially having Lucas's name and story in circulation. "What if we do it, but ask them not to use Lucas's real name or any identifiable photos?" Michael suggested. "It could be educational without exposing him." Sarah agreed, and they gave the interview over the phone, sharing the details of what had happened, the response from the rangers, and the impact it had had on their family. The reporter was respectful and focused primarily on the safety aspects and wilderness management implications rather than sensationalizing the incident. The article, when it appeared, was thoughtful and balanced. Titled, "A Year After Bear Encounter, Family Advocates for Wilderness Safety." It included quotes from the park rangers about proper behavior in bear country and statistics on black bear encounters in Michigan. As requested, it referred to Lucas only as a 3-year-old boy and included no photos of him, using instead a stock image of a black bear and a picture of the warning signs posted at trailheads. The local response to the article was minimal. A few comments on the newspaper's website, mostly from people sharing their own wildlife encounter stories or debating the best ways to respond to a bear sighting. There was no sensationalism, no viral spread of the story beyond the small Upper Peninsula community. It was something of an anticlimax, but Sarah found herself relieved. Their experience remained largely private, a significant but personal chapter in their family history rather than a public spectacle. As summer arrived and the time for the family reunion approached, Lucas's excitement about the beach trip grew. At nearly 4, his memories of the previous year's reunion and the bear encounter had faded somewhat, retained more as fragments of sensation and emotion than as a coherent narrative. "Will there be bears at the beach?" he asked one day as Sarah helped him pack his small suitcase with swim trunks and t-shirts. "No, honey," she replied. "No bears at the beach, just birds and maybe little crabs and fish in the water." Lucas nodded, considering this information. "I like bears," he said after a moment, "but I don't want to touch them anymore." Sarah smiled, recognizing the healthy respect in her son's statement. "That's exactly right, Lucas. Bears are amazing animals, but they're wild. We can appreciate them from a distance." The Florida beach house proved to be an ideal location for the Green family reunion. With its sprawling layout, private beach, access and proximity to family-friendly attractions, it offered something for everyone. The children spent days building sandcastles and splashing in the gentle Gulf waves, while the adults relaxed under umbrellas or took turns organizing activities. Their third evening there, as the family gathered on the deck for a barbecue dinner, Gerald raised his glass in a toast. "To new traditions," he said, looking around at his assembled family, "and to bravery in the face of the unexpected." His eyes rested briefly on Lucas, who was happily devouring a hot dog while sitting between his parents, oblivious to being the subject of his grandfather's toast. Later, as the sun set over the Gulf in a spectacular display of orange and pink, Sarah and Michael walked along the beach with Lucas between them, each holding one of his hands as he jumped over small waves. That washed ashore. "Jump, Mommy, jump, Daddy," he commanded, delighting in the synchronized activity. As they played, Sarah caught Michael's eye over their son's head and smiled. The bear encounter would always be part of their family's story, a frightening chapter that had changed their perspective on wilderness, risk, and the unpredictability of life. The faint scars on Lucas's arm would always be there, physical reminders of how quickly things could change. But here, with the warm sand beneath their feet and their son's laughter ringing in the salty air, the memory of that night in the Michigan forest seemed distant. Not forgotten, never that, but placed in its proper perspective. One event in a lifetime of experiences, a reminder of both the world's dangers and their resilience as a family. As darkness fell and they made their way back to the beach house, Lucas spotted a shooting star arcing across the dark sky. "Make a wish," Sarah told him. Lucas closed his eyes tightly, his face scrunched in concentration. "I wished for ice cream," he announced upon opening them. Michael laughed. "That's a wish that just might come true tonight." Later, after Lucas had enjoyed his wished for ice cream and fallen asleep in the bedroom he shared with his cousins, Sarah and Michael sat on the beach house balcony, listening to the rhythmic sound of waves washing against the shore. "I've been thinking," Michael said quietly, "about what Lucas said about the bear being in its home when he went into the forest." Sarah nodded, pretty insightful for a 3-year-old. "It's made me realize something. We spend so much time trying to control our environment, to make everything safe, especially for our children, but there's always going to be an element of the unknown, the wild, whether it's in a forest or a city or even our own backyard." "So what's the answer?" Sarah asked. "We can't put our children in bubbles." Michael smiled, taking her hand. "No, we can't. I think the answer is teaching them respect for nature, for themselves, for the inherent dangers and beauties of the world, and being there to help them navigate it all." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the moonlight play across the dark water. Somewhere in the distant Michigan woods, the bear that had crossed paths with her son was likely going about its nightly routine, foraging for berries and insects, marking its territory, living the life it was meant to live. And here, in this moment, her family was doing the same, living, learning, adapting, carrying the memory of that encounter, not just as a wound or a trauma, but as hard-earned wisdom about coexisting with the world in all its complexity. In the bedroom down the hall, Lucas slept peacefully, his scarred arm flung above his head, his dreams filled not with frightening bears, but with tomorrow's promises of sandcastles and seashells and the endless playground of the shore. And in the deep Michigan forest, the bear that had once crossed paths with a curious toddler continued through the darkened woods, following ancient instincts and the rhythms of the wilderness. Its brief interaction with humans already faded from whatever passed for memory in its wild mind, leaving only the green sanctuary of the forest and the eternal search for food, shelter, and survival.